So Dr. Luke Wilson is a general practitioner in Wellington. In 2016, Luke conducted the first whole foods plant-based study of its kind in New Zealand, and he's completed a certificate in plant-based nutrition, and he's certified as a physician with the International Board of Lifestyle Medicine. Luke's a member of the New Zealand Medical Association, and he's a director and New Zealand ambassador for the health promotion charity Doctors for Nutrition. He was New Zealand's first member of the American College of Lifestyle Medicine and has experience helping hundreds of people transform their lives by adopting a whole foods plant-based diet. So would you please help me welcoming Dr. Luke Wilson.
Kia ora, Picton. So this is the first time, there we go. The first time I've done this particular talk, and it's also the first time I've spoken in Picton. So it's a night of firsts, and it's also the first time I've been referred to as a wise man. So it started out well, at least. So the talk is called 2006, A Food Odyssey. And I've split it into 3 parts, and this is the first, and it's called Where We Are Now. So in 2006, the world population hit 6.6 billion, which of course was the highest that the world population had ever been. But at the same time, it was also, we reached another milestone. And so for the first time in human history, we had more people on the planet who were overweight or obese than those that were underfed. Not at all coincidentally, around about the same time, give or take a few years, we saw the rise of chronic disease overtake infectious disease as a cause of death and disability. So this is the current state of affairs in New Zealand, and I'm sure you're all fairly familiar with it, so I'll skip through this. What I'd really like to talk about tonight is that there's been a lot of talk about this, and invariably the conclusion is that we're more overweight and unwell because we willfully overeat and we're too lazy to get to the gym often enough. A recent survey of policymakers, about 300 of them internationally, revealed that about 80% of them felt that individuals are very responsible for reducing levels of obesity. And just this year, another survey found that almost a third of doctors believed that weight loss was completely their patient's responsibility. More heartbreakingly, 81% of people with obesity agreed that this was completely their responsibility too. Oh, my emojis haven't worked out quite as well as I like them to. But really? So I'm sure you'd all agree that nurses are well amongst our hardest working and presumably are also most health conscious professionals. Yet in 2008, the average BMI, that's body mass index, for nurses in the United States was 27.2, which puts them well into the overweight category. Perhaps they're just not a very good example. As you might have seen from my bio, in my last year of medical school, I spent some time at 2 clinics in Santa Rosa, California, the McDougall Center and the True North Health Center. People came from all over the US at great expense, and also putting a lot of time into this to learn from the best of the best, how to lose weight and how to improve their health. I kept in contact with a lot of these patients, and although they had some pretty incredible health improvements, a lot of them struggled to maintain these once they returned home. Maybe there's just something wrong with Americans though. So as Hannah mentioned in her introduction, and you might have seen in my bio, a couple of years after I finished med school, I was involved in creating a community-based lifestyle intervention for people in Gisborne who were overweight and who had chronic health problems associated with this. So we taught them what we thought would be everything that they needed to know over about 12 weeks in order to lose weight and to improve their health. And indeed, they achieved some pretty amazing results. So on average, their weight loss was about 12 kgs. But the further we got away from the program, the more often they were choosing to eat foods we had suggested weren't best for their health, as you can see there. And in fact, when we actually look at it, what we find is that people's weights are increasing everywhere in the world. We don't have an obesity epidemic, we have an obesity pandemic. That's an epidemic that's spread throughout the world. And as you can see, we're doing best in our English-speaking high-income countries, and also in Polynesia, which puts New Zealand sort of right in the middle of this. But whether you're looking in Asia, Latin America, the Caribbean, or even Africa, weights are increasing. Why would this be the case? I'm really disappointed about those emojis. To discover the answers to these questions, but more importantly to understand the answers, we'll have to journey back in time to the dawn of humankind. Which brings us to part 2, how we got here. So our closest ancestors, as you're probably aware, are the chimpanzees and bonobos. Now those guys eat plants. Nearly half of all the food consumed by chimps appears to be figs, and just 3% of the average chimp diet comes from meat. So on average, about 9 days a year are meat days for them. But these guys have a problem when it comes to the amount of time they spend eating. Does anyone know how long this is? Any ideas? Rough guesses? Yeah. So they spend about 6 to 8 hours a day, and they consume about 6 kilograms of food. So in order for us to change our anatomy and to increase our brain size, we needed to learn how to process our food. Now we used to think that we got around this simply by increasing our meat intake, but there's broader agreement nowadays that actually what might have happened is that we used fire to cook our food, and this is most likely the reason why, and that this probably happened up to about 1.9 million years ago. Now cooking food, like other forms of processing, what it actually does is it makes more energy available to us, and so it also allowed us to rely on otherwise fairly unpalatable and indigestible foods such as tubers like these. So about 300,000 years ago, our species is likely to have been evolving as naturally omnivorous, sure, but with a diet which was always dominated by plant foods, supplemented by varying shares of meat, with much of our food being cooked. So the diet and lifestyle of the gatherer-hunters is likely to have looked a lot like this. So we lived in groups of up to about 150, and society was described as being fiercely egalitarian. Our food was scarce, varied, seasonal, unprocessed, and always organic, of course. We ate mostly plants, so meat was eaten in quantities of perhaps 10 to 20 kilograms a year. We had a very high fibre diet, which is because it was mostly plants, and it was also very low fat. And as you'll all be aware, we were highly physically active back then, about 4 to 7 hours a day. And this was very successful. So this allowed us to migrate to the 4 corners of the globe, pretty much. So we got to New Zealand a little bit later than that. So now we'll fast forward about 290,000 years. And this is the point when we started planting and harvesting our own food. The adoption of agriculture resulted in some really big changes to our lifestyles and to our food environment. So we can now live in towns and cities, and up to a fifth of the population were actually released from food production completely. The diet at this point was much more stable, but it was less varied, less seasonal, probably a little bit more processed, and of course the food was still organic. At this point, we actually reduced the amount of meat that we ate, so we still did mostly plants, and we probably did 5 to 10 kilograms of meat a year. The diet remained high fibre and low in fat. Of course, it became a little bit less physically active. It also brought about some developments that would have been quite foreign to our gatherer-hunter ancestors. Private ownership, markets, and trade, and this is probably about the time that we all started worrying about the economy. Now, if we fast forward again, some 9,650 years of agriculture, there was a second agricultural revolution, and this time it took place in Britain. Now this was driven to some extent at least by a practice called Enclosure. Now previously subsistence farmers have been able to farm on communal land in order to provide for their families and communities. But at this point farmland started being divided up and individual farmers would take control of the land, and that gave them incentive and also the ability to be able to improve the yields on that land. And one of the ways that they did this was using a process called crop rotation. There were also improvements in technology, especially the plough. And the other thing that really helped was the establishment of national as opposed to regional markets, driven by London and other growing cities. As you can see, illustrated rather spectacular fashion by this graph, this had a really big effect on population growth, especially. You can see it's almost vertical, that line. And by about 100 years later, there was a large population of people with no access to subsistence agriculture, which provided a mass consumer market which ushered in the era of industrial capitalism. This resulted in the generation of a working class, as well as in mass industrialised production of goods and factories, both of which would have a huge impact on both food production and culture. So if we skip forward about another 295 years from the second agricultural revolution, this brings us to the end of World War II. Now, after World War II, governments and populations who had experienced rationing were very, very keen to make sure they had plenty of everything after that. And after the war, most people expected there to be another Great Depression, actually. But what actually ended up happening with the cessation of hostilities was the ushering in of what's been termed the Golden Age of Capitalism. So industry and technology that had been developed and focused on the war efforts could now be repurposed to generate consumer goods, and nations experienced rampant economic growth. So governments in the United States and Europe, they decided to pay farmers subsidies to incentivise the volume of food produced rather than the quality. And this is one of the things that led to the intensification of farming that we're now quite familiar with. And this ushered in what we can call the Age of Plenty, which is our current food environment. So what's it characterised by? So probably the main characteristic of the Age of Plenty is that it's the abundance of processed food. So there was a study just published in New Zealand which showed that about 70% of the packaged supermarket food that's available on the shelves is ultra-processed. And in fact, in the United States, about 60% of their diet comes from these ultra-processed foods. Our diet is low in fibre, it's high in fat, it's high in oils, sugar and salt, and these things are all things that you can use to make foods more addictive and to hit this bliss point, which is the optimum deliciousness of food that makes you want to keep eating, basically. As I spoke about way back when we started using fire, any processing that you do to food will actually increase the energy that you can get from it. So these processed foods, even though they might say they're 300 calories or however many kilojoules, compared to 300 calories or kilojoules of an equivalent unprocessed food, you're actually going to absorb more of those. So what we've done, as you can see, in moving from the diet that was most like our ancestors towards what we're doing now, we have moved from those green foods on the left-hand side of the graph, which is your plant-based foods, which are low in calorie density, to the foods more on the right-hand side, which you can see are very high in comparison. At the same time, our modern lives have become more and more time-pressured, and we have become more and more isolated. Most of us spend as much or more time sitting at a desk most days of the week as our chimpanzee friends spend eating their food. And our meals, especially breakfast and lunch times, are often rushed and eaten in isolation. So it's unsurprising that this age is also remarkable for the rise of fast food and snack foods. Now, if circumstances weren't favourable enough to the sales of processed and fast foods, we also allow them to be marketed relentlessly, including to our most impressionable citizens. So this is from a recent, I think the study was last year, where they found that children in their community, so this is not what they see on TV or see at the supermarket because there was too many ads to count, but they'll be exposed to 15 ads a day for unhealthy food. If they do turn on the TV, then there'll be 8 ads an hour for unhealthy food on their kids' TV during the prime time. When these guys have been tried to be restricted in the past, they're not opposed to using the same kind of tactics as the cigarette industry to stop public health people from limiting their ability to market like this. If you look in the UK, between 1997 and 2009, basically if they had GST, they basically took it off junk food. So the price of junk food there fell 15%, and the price of fruit and vegetables in comparison increased 7% over that time. So in the age of plenty, how are we eating and living? So now we're living in cities, we're increasingly isolated, and our society is increasingly unequal. Food has become plentiful, but it's comparatively monotonous, it's non-seasonal, it's ultra-processed, and it's almost always non-organic. We've gone from eating mostly plants to eating few plants. So the average New Zealander eats more than 100 kilograms of meat a year. The diet consequently has become low in fibre and high in fat, and to add to all of that, we've become minimally physically active, largely as a consequence of our lifestyles, I would argue. So Dr. David Katz, who's the past president of the American College of Lifestyle Medicine, often likens our situation to polar bears in the Sahara. And hopefully you can see why we're not particularly well adapted to our current food environment and why the current pandemic of chronic disease is almost an inevitable consequence. Which brings us to part 3, where to from here. So firstly, I'd like to suggest that we do very well to return more to eating like our ancestors do, which would be a more plant-based way of eating. As you can see, a whole food plant-based way of eating emphasises plant-based foods that are unprocessed. And what happens if we return to this way of eating? Well, here's an example from Cardiovascular Disease. So Dr. Dean Ornish and Dr. Corbett Wesselston in the Lifestyle Heart Trial and the Wellness Institute at Cleveland Clinic have both shown the low-fat, plant-based way of eating will actually not only stabilise cardiovascular disease, but in many cases reverse it. And that's before and after picture of the left anterior descending artery. And we can see from this slide here that Dr. Wesselston's protocol is substantially more effective than any other current medical treatment that we have. So the repeat event rate for Dr. Wesselston was about 1 in 200. If you want to take the best medical therapy we have, your chance is about 1 in 5 of having a repeat event. And right at the bottom of the screen in the multicoloured image there, this is really exciting. So this is the blood flow to the heart, and the most exciting thing about this picture is that the images were taken about 3 weeks apart. So that's how quickly these changes will happen. When it comes to type 2 diabetes, Neil Barnard has shown that a low-fat, plant-based diet is more effective in reducing blood sugar levels than conventional diets for diabetes. The Adventist Health Study too showed that a plant-based way of eating substantially lowered your risk of developing diabetes, and that risk reduction was not related to people's weight, so it was something to do with the food that they were eating. The Gemini study, so this is Dr. Dean Ornish's work again. This time they took men with low-grade prostate cancer, and what you can actually see there on the right of your screen is they've looked at the genetic level, and they found that these lifestyle changes they made, including the low-fat plant-based way of eating, turned off 50 genes that were going to make the cancer progress and turned on 450 that we believe would stop the cancer from progressing. So you can see those changes on that cellular level pretty much there. They found also, of course, that the PSA in the men decreased, and here's another exciting result, is they found that the blood, when they took it off these men and had some prostate cancer cells in a lab, it was about almost 8 times more effective at preventing the growth of those prostate cancer cells than the men who had not made the lifestyle changes. This is Walter Longo, who some of you, if you've watched the How Not to Get Cancer documentary, he features in that. That's him with his good friend Salvatore Caruso, who at the time was one of the oldest men in the world. And Walter did a large study which he showed that basically high animal protein intake, you had a 75% increased risk of dying of any cause, and a 4-fold increase of cancer death risk during the following 18 years. And you didn't find those associations if people were getting most of their protein intake from plants. So that's the prescription, but how are we actually going to get there? And I'd hope from having the information presented to you tonight in the way that I have done, that many of you will go home and you'll clear out your pantries and you'll just fill them up with whole plant-based foods. So there's definitely a role for individual initiative in this. But at the same time, I would hope that the way that I've presented this information to you tonight, all of you will see that we need to do more than this for the sake of the health of our communities, and also to enable ourselves to maintain the changes long term. And I hear from the chuckles that we may actually need to do that so that you can even get started with it. So we need some high level changes, I feel, and we could do these within, obviously the best case scenario would be if we did these on a nationwide level, but I think, regional councils or healthcare providers, these could be things that they could look at, the first two at least. And the first thing would be actually incentivising the production and sale of healthy foods. So at the moment, you guys, from how I've presented things, you'll be aware that the best way to make money from selling food is to make it as cheap as possible, to make it as tasty as possible, which also means that it's very unhealthy usually. And so that's where all the incentives lie economically. We need to be able to regulate the food industry, and that needs to happen. I doubt there'll be too many people in here that would disagree with the idea of perhaps not allowing them to market to children. Chile, in fact, is ahead of us in having both a sugary drinks tax and also having banned the use of cartoon characters to sell food to kids, which, it's not rocket science. And then if you get even higher level than that, what we might want to look at doing is aim for a steady state economy. That's one that's not based around the idea that we just have this constant growth and that it's all about profit. And that's why redefining success, in order for us to allow governments to do this and politicians, we actually need to let them redefine success, and it's not all just about the GDP. Obviously, with the most recent budget, at least it had that kind of focus on well-being, or at least that's how they pushed it. And I think that's sort of opening the door and sort of in the right direction for things to move forward in a way that will improve health for all New Zealand. In conclusion, what I really want you guys to take away from tonight is the idea that our food environment is what's causing the chronic disease pandemic. It's not individuals. It's not us being weak or not making the right choices. When 70% of the food that you're going to get at the supermarket is ultra-processed, it's very hard to make those correct choices. Our economic system and incentives, along with a little bit of human nature, as you probably deduced, have created this situation. Now, both of these are very different to those that we would have experienced for almost all of our history. And a plant-based or mostly plant-based diet that's high in unprocessed foods is most conducive to our health, and I think that high-level changes are required. Thank you.